At least at my own daughter's engagement dinner, I know which one of my children isn't going to embarrass me. My mother said it loud enough for the whole patio to hear, her hand resting on my older sister's shoulder like a trophy she'd just been handed. And then her eyes swung over to me, parked by the drinks cooler in my work fleece because I'd come straight from a 12-hour shift. 38 relatives and family friends went quiet on that patio in Kelowna, every one of them turning to look at the woman in the navy paramedic jacket holding a can of Kootenay she hadn't even opened yet. My mother smiled the way she always smiled when she was about to land something cruel and call it a joke. 41 years old, no husband, no children, driving around in an ambulance for $48,000 a year when you could have gone into law like your sister. I bet the other paramedics call you the den mother, don't they, since you mother everyone except yourself. 30-some people laughed. Not a polite ripple, a real laugh, the kind that only happens when the person at the head of the table fires the shot and everyone else feels safer joining than standing apart. I didn't flinch. I didn't put the can down hard or storm off toward the house. I looked straight at my mother, past the new highlights she'd gotten for the party, past the lip filler, past 41 years of her deciding I was the disappointment, and I said one word, Atlas. A wine glass shattered on the flagstone behind me. Over by the little bar table my brother-in-law had set up near the pergola, a man I'd never met before that afternoon, silver hair, forearms like rope, somewhere in his 60s, had gone completely white. His glass had slipped right out of his hand. He was a retired Royal Canadian Air Force search and rescue tech, my sister's fiancé's uncle, flown in from Nova Scotia for the engagement. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that a stranger had just dropped a glass of red wine at the sound of my own call sign. "Stop," he said, and his voice came out rough, like something dragged. Oh my God, that's Atlas. Then, right in front of my mother and the 30-some people who'd just been laughing at her joke, this man I'd never spoken to in my life snapped to attention and saluted me. The laughing died on that patio like someone had cut the power. But before I tell you why, a man who'd spent his career hauling people out of the worst water and worst weather this country has to offer was standing there shaking at the sight of me, and what my mother had coming to her that night for every single year of looking down on me, hit that like button and subscribe. Because nobody on that patio saw what came next. The man lowered his hand and turned to my mother. There was nothing polite left in his face. None of the deference a guest is supposed to show a host who's just fed him salmon and Caesars all afternoon. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a manila envelope, soft at the corners, taped along one edge from being opened and closed too many times. He set it flat on the picnic table and spread out the contents. Newspaper clippings, maybe a dozen of them, arranged by date, everyone scrubbed clean by whatever review process they go through before publication. No name, no photograph that would point straight at me. But someone had circled details on every single one. Unit designations, lake names, conditions. Connect the dots and there was only one person it could be. Every time one of these ran, he said, voice still scraped raw, I cut it out. Because people like her never tell anyone what they actually do. The laughing hadn't fully recovered. It had frozen somewhere in the middle of a breath. 38 people stood around that backyard in Kelowna, knowing less about their own blood than a man who'd flown in from Halifax that morning, holding a worn envelope. I didn't say anything. I picked my drink back up and set it down again on the exact ring of condensation it had already left on the wood. My eyes weren't on the man, weren't on my mother. I was scanning the yard out of pure habit, the same way I scan a scene before I commit to it. Who was looking for the nearest exit? Who was waiting for me to lose it so they could say, see, this is exactly what we're talking about. My mother was watching me the same way. That was the next beat in her script. Reeve makes a scene. Reeve can't handle a compliment without making it about herself. My silence was the one thing she'd never built a counter for. My mother recovered first. She always did. Her voice dropped into that warm, patient register she used when she was explaining something simple to someone too dense to get it on their own. Garrett, she said. That was his name. I'd learn later. I appreciate the gesture truly. But Reeve has always had a tendency to make more of her job than it is. Even as a kid, she lived in her own little world. A small laugh moved through the crowd, the relieved kind, the kind that comes when people think someone's finally talked the tension back down. My sister chimed in, right on cue, eyebrows pulled together in manufactured concern. Reeve, are you okay? You seem really stressed lately. Is everything all right at home? That question was engineered down to the syllable. It moved me in one sentence, from someone who'd just been saluted to someone who needed checking on. Not a hero, a patient. They didn't argue with Garrett directly, they just made everyone wonder if I was stable enough to be taken seriously. Burnt out, not capable. Fragile, not respected. I set my can down. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds held, 4 seconds out. The box breathing they teach you in EMS school for exactly this kind of moment, except I'd never had to use it on my own family before. I walked over to Garrett and shook his hand firm, eye to eye. "Thank you for coming out," I said. Just enough for him to know I knew exactly who he was, even though I'd never met him. He leaned in close, his voice dropping below the noise of the yard. "Holt Mercer," he said. "He's getting an award tomorrow night in Vancouver. Lifetime achievement, paid for by the foundation his old crew set up. Money raised by the families of the men he left out there." I nodded once. Something in my chest had already started moving. I didn't go inside after the party wound down. I sat in my truck out front of my mother's house, engine off, windows up, hands at 10 and 2, like I was still flying something through crosswind, which is a strange habit for someone whose job is mostly ground-based, but old training doesn't leave you. When I reached over to fold up a camp chair into the truck bed, my hand brushed against a purse my mother had left on the passenger seat. Wallet, keys, and a photo from the year I turned 16. My mother stood in the center of it, arm around my sister's shoulders, a dozen relatives arranged tight around the two of them like petals around the middle of a flower. I was off to the right edge, no hand on my shoulder, no one's body angled toward mine. Not because I'd chosen to stand apart. Because I'd ended up in whatever space was left once everyone else had already arranged themselves around the people who mattered. I looked at my own 16-year-old face in that picture. Not sad, not angry, flat. The expression of someone who'd already learned that being overlooked wasn't an event. It was just the climate you lived in. The memories didn't come back in order after that. They came in pieces. The year I got accepted into the paramedic program, my mother didn't ask when graduation was, didn't put it on the calendar, never mentioned it to a single relative. The year my sister made partner at her firm, my mother booked a private room at a restaurant downtown 2 weeks in advance, picked the menu herself, called every cousin in the family to come. The year I mailed home my first commendation, a small plaque from the Regional Health Authority for a multi-vehicle pileup on the Coquihalla, where I'd kept 3 people alive in whiteout conditions until SARS could get a helicopter down, my mother put the box in a hall closet without opening it. "A piece of plastic," she said. "What's that supposed to prove?" The year my sister bought her first condo, my mother posted it on Facebook with the caption, "So proud of my girl, not once an accident." A system maintained without fail for 2 decades. My sister was seen. I was tolerated. The sharpest memory of all of it. I was 19, standing in our kitchen telling my mother I'd been accepted into a search and rescue technician program out east, attached through the military reserves. She didn't get angry. She got sorry for me, voice gentle, almost sweet, the tone you'd use to explain a hard diagnosis to a patient who couldn't quite grasp it. "Oh, Reeve, honey, kids who don't have any other options go into things like that. Not an attack." A verdict delivered before I'd even started. "You've already failed, so this is what you're settling for." My sister was at the counter doing her nails and didn't even look up. She never had to raise a hand. My mother held the knife. My sister just kept the door open for her. That was the first time I understood, with total clarity, that my mother hadn't just doubted me. She decided, long before I was old enough to prove anything either way, that this particular daughter had nothing worth betting on. The decision never got revised. Not once in 22 years. I put the photo in the glove box, didn't throw it out, kept it the way you keep evidence you might need later. That training never left me, either. Every shift, every call, every patient I brought back was an answer that never needed words. But something had shifted that night after the name had left my mouth on the patio, and Garrett had whispered Vancouver to me by the bar table. Not inside me, around me. This time the truth wasn't getting folded up and put away for another decade. Fall, 11 years back. Late November, a storm rolling in off the Pacific that nobody had forecast correctly, visibility down to almost nothing on Kootenay Lake. A fishing boat with 6 people aboard had capsized 2 kilometers from shore, water temperature low enough that survival time was measured in minutes, not hours. The Joint Rescue Coordination Center order came through clear as anything. All air assets returned to base, conditions unsafe for further response. And under that order, a voice I'd carry around in my skull for the rest of my career, calm as a man ordering a coffee. "Commander Holt Mercer, stand down. All assets RTB. Final." I was strapped into the back of a cormorant when the last distress call cut through the static, a voice too young for the situation he was in. 21 years old, first deployment on the water, first time understanding that backup was a word that could mean absolutely nothing. He didn't scream. He said 4 words, small and clear, the way a kid asks to be carried. "Someone please." That settled every calculation I'd ever need to make again. The flight engineer beside me, a guy named Wesley, no, not Wesley, doesn't matter. His name was Daniel, looked at me, 26 years old, 3 weeks from his own wedding, and I saw the exact second he understood we were going anyway. He didn't argue. He cinched his harness one more notch and said 2 words. "Your call." That's what trust looks like once the rulebook's been stripped away, and all that's left is whether you believe the person beside you is going to bring you home. I gave the go. We flew into a wall of sleet and freezing spray that felt less like weather and more like something trying to physically stop us. The aircraft took its first real hit 2 minutes in, Master caution lights going off across the panel one after another. I cut the audio because I needed to hear the airframe more than I needed to hear it screaming at me that something was wrong. Blind hover over black water, holding position by feel and instinct more than instruments. When the rescue swimmer hauled the first person up, unconscious, lighter than I expected, his fingers were locked around the swimmer's harness in a death grip that didn't let go even after he'd passed out. We took a second hard knock on the climb out, a shudder that ran the length of the airframe hard enough to rattle my fillings. I held the hover anyway. 5 came home that night, 1 didn't make it. But the kid who'd said someone please was not the one we lost. Commander Mercer had connections that went 3 levels above his own rank, and an instinct for self-preservation that outweighed everything else he was supposed to stand for. Within 72 hours of us landing, paperwork showed up on my file like it had been pre-written. Insubordination. Endangering aircraft and crew. Disregard for a direct stand-down order. Every word built to make it sound like I'd been the threat, not the storm, not the men in the water, not the man who'd signed off on leaving them there from a warm command post. A reporter at one of the Vancouver papers got an anonymous tip. The kind of anonymous that comes from somebody with 3 stripes on their shoulder. The story wrote itself exactly the way Mercer needed it to. Rogue flight engineer disobeys direct order, risks aircraft for personal glory. Nobody printed the part about 5 people coming home. Nobody called Daniel to ask what actually happened in that cockpit. The story was already set before anyone checked it. I called home. The only time in my life I cried to my mother on the phone, not as a SAR tech, not as anything official, just as her daughter, sitting on the edge of a cot 4,000 kilometers from anyone who was supposed to love me without conditions. I told her about the storm, the boy, the hands locked around the swimmer's harness, the charges, the article, Mercer's name. She listened without saying a word the whole way through, and for one stupid, fragile second I thought, maybe this is the thing. Maybe hearing your kid's voice break is the sound that finally gets through. She waited until I'd gone quiet. Then she said, flat, almost bored, I told you this would happen. That job was never going to take you seriously. And she hung up. No goodbye, just dead air where her voice had been a second earlier. I held the phone to my ear for almost a full minute after that, watching the second hand on the wall clock across from my cot, before it fully landed that she wasn't coming back on the line, that she'd never really been there to begin with. 2 days later, my fiancé at the time called, not to ask if I was okay, not to ask what had actually happened out there. He wanted my mailing address so he could send the paperwork to formally end things before it could touch his job at the bank. He'd read the headline before he'd thought to call his own partner. He didn't say sorry. He said, I need this sorted before it becomes a problem for me. The one person who held the line for me through all of it was my commanding officer at the time, a woman named Vivienne, no, a man actually. General terms aside, he arranged a quiet transfer that pulled my file out of anywhere Mercer's people could reach it, built me a cover role on paper, administrative liaison, 3 words designed to make me invisible to anybody looking for the SAR tech from that storm. He told me, standing in an office with the blind shut, you don't need to win today. You need to survive long enough to win later. And when that day comes, I will be standing right there. That's not a favor between friends. That's an order. Are we clear? I told him yes, sir. He said good. Now go be invisible and be excellent at it. I came back to the present sitting in my truck outside my mother's house. 11 years had passed since Kootenay Lake. A full decade plus change, and my mother had never once, not a call, not a text, not at Christmas, not on a single one of my birthdays, asked how I'd actually come through any of it. Not the storm, not the charges, not the broken engagement. Not the nights where staying upright took a decision I had to make fresh every single hour, like renewing a contract with my own life. But Garrett had kept the clippings. My old CO had kept his word. The kid I'd pulled out of that water, Theo, no, the kid was named something I won't use here, still sent me a card every year with nothing written inside but his name. Tomorrow night in Vancouver, all of that was finally going to cost something. The parties scattered into uncomfortable little clusters after that. Nobody knew what to do with what they'd just watched. So people did what people do, they left fast and pretended none of it had happened. My mother went back inside without another word. My sister stood in the doorway and gave Garrett a look I couldn't read. I was pulling my keys out of my pocket when Garrett followed me out to the driveway. Didn't ask permission, just fell into step, the way one person who's seen things falls into step beside another. You don't have to say anything, he started. I just want you to know one thing. He held the envelope out toward me again. Worn soft, taped along one edge, opened and closed more times than paper should be able to survive. First time I saw one of these clippings was about 2 years after the lake, he said. Wasn't sure it was you, but I kept it anyway, in case. I looked down at the top one. My hands didn't shake, but it took me a few seconds before I could look back up. Why'd you keep them, I asked. My voice came out flat, not grateful exactly. Investigating. He let out a short laugh. Because the night that cormorant came down out of the storm, I thought I was looking at something that shouldn't have been possible. Afterward, I sat in the debrief asking myself, does anybody out there even know what she did? The answer was no, so I figured at least one person should hold proof that she showed up. Something pulled tight behind my sternum. Not sad, not happy, recognition. While my mother was telling relatives I'd never amount to much, while my fiancé was mailing off paperwork to end an engagement, while a newspaper was running Mercer's version of the story, a stranger had been quietly clipping articles and keeping a record nobody else had bothered to keep. Mercer's in Vancouver tomorrow night, Garrett said, all the warmth gone out of his voice now. Lifetime Achievement Award, paid for with money raised by the families of the men he left behind. He folded the envelope shut and pressed it into my hand. This belongs to you now, he said. Proof that you were there. I sat in the truck a long while with the envelope on the passenger seat before I reached for my phone and called a number I hadn't dialed in months. My old CO picked up on the second ring, like he'd been sitting right next to it. I was just about to get out when my mother came around the side of the house faster than I expected, carrying a plate wrapped in cling film. Leftover squares from the dessert table. This was her oldest move, the one she pulled out whenever logic failed and denial wasn't holding. Offer food. Have you eaten? She said. Voice gone soft and worried, a switch she could flip whenever she needed to. I looked at the plate, the same lemon squares she made every single year for my sister's birthday. Not once in 41 years had she made them for me, and here they were, offered up at 10 at night in a driveway, held out by hands that had never once reached toward me without wanting something back. I'm fine, I said, flat as a hospital corridor. She didn't move. Garrett exaggerates, she said. Old guys like that, they tell stories. I'm not saying he's lying, I'm just saying it was a long time ago. Memory plays tricks. I watched her face the way I'd been trained to watch a scene, jaw tightening, eyes flicking toward the back door to check who was still in earshot. This wasn't a private moment between a mother and her kid. This was damage control with an audience. My sister appeared behind her, phone in hand but not looking at it. Are you okay, Reeve? Like, actually okay? We worry about you. Always off on your own, no real support system. The question was built down to the syllable, to move me from someone who'd just been saluted to someone who needed to be managed. I looked at her, and for the first time all night, something in my face shifted. Just enough that she'd know I'd clocked every line of the script. I'm not doing this tonight, I said, hand flat on the truck door. Not because I don't have things to say. Because tonight isn't when you're ready to hear them. I got in, started the engine, didn't check the mirror. 1 a.m, kitchen table, a single lamp on. I didn't sleep that night so much as wait for the sun to come up so I could drive to Vancouver. The award dinner was at a hotel ballroom downtown, chandeliers, a red carpet from the door to the main floor, a room full of people who'd never once had to breathe in anything that burned. Garrett walked in beside me. I wore my dress uniform, not for show, but because it was the only language everyone in that room understood without translation. A man with a champagne flute stopped me near the entrance. I don't see your name on the list, ma'am. I'm not on the list, I said. I'm here as a witness. He didn't say anything else. From across the room, I picked Mercer out of a cluster of donors, silver-haired, comfortable, in a way that told me he'd been collecting praise so long he'd forgotten it wasn't the same thing as character. His eyes landed on me from 15 feet away, and the color drained out of his face the way blood leaves when it drops to your feet. He registered the uniform first, then the insignia, then, underneath all of it, the face he'd spent 11 years trying to scrub out of every file he could reach. He came over before the program started, hand out, projecting warmth he didn't feel. You look well, he said. The sentence wasn't a greeting, it was reconnaissance. I let the silence sit 3 full seconds. Well enough to remember the lake, I said. He pulled his hand back. The program opened with the MC reading off his achievements, decisive leadership, unwavering commitment, every word a small insult to everyone in the room who'd actually paid for them. Mercer took the podium, and somewhere in the middle of his speech, voice dipped into rehearsed sorrow. He said something about people who couldn't handle the pressure of the job, who built up stories to cover their own discipline problems, and he looked dead at my table when he said it. A chair scraped back. Garrett stood, one hand on the table for balance, voice carrying without a microphone. I was there. 4 words, and the whole room turned. Then a man in a wheelchair near the front pushed himself upright and said he'd been on that boat. Then a woman stood and said she'd treated the survivors that night, that no rescue had ever officially been authorized, only 1 aircraft had gone out, alone. Then, from the back, a young man stood up, the same one who'd been sending me a card every year with nothing in it but his name, and all he said was, "You didn't leave me out there." Mercer's hands went white on the podium. My old CO stood from the front row and announced that the records from that night had been partly declassified the month before, the original order, the after-action report, all of it. The room rose to its feet in absolute silence, salute after salute, row by row. I stood and returned it. From the back of the room, I saw my mother by the door. She'd followed me out to Vancouver to see for herself whether Garrett had been telling the truth or whether I really was the embarrassment she'd built me up to be in her own head all these years. She slid down the wall to the floor, hand over her mouth. 3 days later, she knocked on my door with a tin of lemon squares, the same recipe, baked for me for the first time in my life. I stood in the doorway and didn't step back. "You didn't know," I said. "Or you chose not to believe me. You had my number every single year. You chose not to use it." She cried, not the kind that comes from understanding, the kind that comes from drowning in shame too big to hold. I told her to go home and not come back, not in anger, in the voice of someone who'd arrived at that decision over a decade of quiet thinking, not one bad night. I closed the door. The lock turning over was the simplest, most final sound in the whole story. That same week, Mercer asked to meet me at a diner off the highway, his choice, not mine. He admitted everything across a sticky plastic table, voice shaking too hard to hold his coffee steady. When he finished, he asked why I hadn't come forward sooner. "Because hate is dead weight on a long climb," I told him. "I used those years to get stronger instead. Every shift I worked, every person I brought home, all of it happened because I refused to let you be the whole story of my life. My existence, still standing, is the sentence you'll carry for the rest of your days, and there's no appeal." I left cash on the table and walked out into the daylight. A week later, Garrett called, not about Mercer, not about my mother. Just asked if I wanted to come sit in on a peer support group he ran on Wednesdays for first responders and search and rescue folks. I drove out in a ball cap, sat in the corner with my back to the wall, the habit I'll carry the rest of my life. A young paramedic in the circle, maybe 2 years on the job, sat folded in on himself, eyes on the floor. "I know what that posture is," I said, standing up without planning to. "The worst part isn't the call itself. It's coming home and convincing yourself that shutting everyone out is what keeps you safe. It isn't. It's just a different kind of drowning." He looked up at me. "Why do they call you Atlas?" he asked. "Doesn't that mean carrying the whole world?" I smiled, for the first time in longer than I could count, the real kind. "It does," I said. "But for the people who flew with me, it meant something else. It meant no matter how far down or how far out someone fell, I'd come and bring them back." Driving home that night with the window down, I thought about my mother sitting alone in that house, the family photo probably still hanging exactly where it had always hung, me at the very edge of the frame. I thought about Mercer, about to spend the rest of his life, knowing a room full of people had watched the truth dismantle him in real time. I thought about my sister, somewhere drafting a text that would somehow still make this my fault. I'd flown into every version of that storm there was, the lake, the charges, the phone call that ended without a goodbye, and I'd carried myself out of all of it, not because anyone rescued me. Because I decided, every day for 11 years, that I was worth the trip back. The quiet in the truck wasn't loneliness anymore. It was what's left once the worst of it has already passed through you, and you're still standing on the other side of it. Atlas, finally, was at rest.